Before colonization, before the Bible, before the Quran, Africa already had prophets. But we forgot them. As the words unfold, the camera pans over misty savannas and stone shrines, drifting finally into the flickering flames of a firelit ritual. In that moment, the air thickens with reverence. We are invited into a realm beyond text and empire, to meet voices once honored, now forgotten. These voices were not spiritual relics or distant myths. They were the living conduits of divine will, medicine, morality, and cosmic guidance. Across West Africa, screaming drums carried Orisa through flesh. In the Rift Valley, ancestral spirits entered the bodies of Sangomas. In the forests of Benin and the plains of Ashanti, oracles held the fate of kings in their hands. Kingdoms rose and fell based not on statutes or armies, but on ancestral instruction rendered through sacred trance. The prophets were not sidelined mystics. They were central figures of authority, wisdom, and power. Yet this sacred architecture of voice and vision was systematically dismantled. Colonial and missionary powers branded these spiritual messengers as witches and demons, tamed their rituals as superstition, and replaced prophecy with imported doctrines. The ancestral voices were relegated to hushed whispers, or erased entirely. And in that erasure, a profound rupture occurred, not only of tradition, but of collective memory and spiritual guardianship. Tonight, we begin a journey to retrieve what was lost. We will explore how prophecy functioned in African spirituality, not as mere fortune-telling, but as divine alignment, moral reckoning, and ancestral instruction. We will witness the rise and fall of prophets whose words shaped empires, from Ifa priests guiding Obas in Benin to Akomfo and Okie summoning a celestial throne over Ashanti lands. We will travel into ceremonies where the gods filled human vessels, where trance brought divine presence into community life, and where prophecy was woven into justice, war, healing, and identity. Then we will confront the erasure, the burning of shrines, the silencing of mediums, the policies that labeled divine voice as pagan. We will ask why these traditions were suppressed, what was lost in the process, and how their absence has shaped modern spiritual landscapes. But this is not a story of despair. In the latter part of our journey, we will meet those who have kept the flame alive: Babalawos, Sangomas, Vodun priests, and young initiates who continue to listen for spirit voices in dreams, chants, and ceremony. By the end, viewers will understand that these prophets never truly left. They were silenced. But their voices echo still, waiting. By remembering them, we reclaim not only a spiritual legacy, but a path to wisdom, justice, and cosmic alignment. Welcome to Africosmos 1, and welcome back to those ancient voices. In African cosmology, the role of a prophet diverges significantly from Western expectations of fortune-telling or sermonizing. Rather than predicting the future, African prophets serve as vital conduits of divine insight, guiding communities back into harmony with ancestral, spiritual, and cosmic orders. They are entrusted not merely with foresight, but with correction, restoring balance when relationships fracture, when ethical standards slip, or when spiritual dissonance darkens communal life. Their authority does not stem from institutional hierarchy, but from spiritual calibration and moral alignment. When a crisis erupts, be it drought, conflict, or disease, it is the prophet whose spiritual sensing offers clarity, whose ritual interventions restore flow, whose voice channels ancestral memory back into living action. Across the continent, prophecy takes culturally specific yet spiritually resonant forms. Among the Yoruba, the Babalawos sits at the heart of Ifa, a complex, divination-based spiritual system. Equipped with sacred palm nuts, kola seeds, and an intricate corpus of Odu verses, the Babalawo interprets the will of Orunmila, the deity of wisdom and destiny. Each verse guides individuals and communities through personal hardship or societal shifts. Prophecy is not speculation. It is revelation, encoded in a divinatory language rooted in cosmic pattern and ancestral covenant. Further south in what is now South Africa, the Sangoma responds to trance-induced possession by ancestral spirits. The Sangoma enters the body state known as Ukuthwasa, calling, where ancestors literally ride the vessel, speaking through voice, gesture, and healing ritual. In this ecstatic channeling, the Sangoma becomes a living oracle, able to diagnose spiritual ailments, guide families, and navigate communal disputes. The trance moment becomes the stage for cosmic dialogue, guided not by logic but by spiritual resonance and ancestral imperative. Along the coast of West Africa, Fon traditions speak of the Bokonon, diviners and spirit mediators within Vodun belief systems. Through trance, poetry, and material art like vives, spiritual symbols drawn on the ground, the Bokonon maps unseen relationships among gods, humans, and nature. Their prophecies restore sight when the community's vision falters, channeling spirits that are neither foreboding nor gentle, but precisely corrective. The prophecy of the Bokonon is systemic. It reweaves existential threads torn by human error or spiritual apathy, restoring the tapestry of community. In Central Africa, the Congo's Nganga conducts analogous work. Rooted in Congo cosmology, the Nganga uses Nkisi, spiritual objects that hold power, to mediate between realms. Naming, anointing, and invocation bring spirit into chosen vessels, creating a living nexus of divine speech. The prophecy here is not a prediction but a binding contract. Ancestors speak, and the living must act. Rituals that follow the prophecy activate spiritual potential, balancing individual action against collective well-being. In Ghana, the Ashanti Akomfo, priests or priestesses, embody oracular authority within a Akan society. Trained in sacred songs, mythic genealogies, and constitutional law, Akomfo interpret divine will for chiefs and citizens alike. In legend, the most famous Akomfo, Anoki, summoned the golden stool from heaven, establishing spiritual sovereignty for the Ashanti and anchoring imperial unity in cosmic legitimacy. From that moment onward, the stool itself became oracular, speaking in ceremonies that connected rulers to ancestors and the divine. Despite cultural differences, what unites these figures is their function as spiritual technicians. They interpret cosmic registers, signs in the sky, rhythms of nature, patterns in ritual objects, to deliver guidance that restores balance. They are not preachers preaching doctrine or scriptures. They do not convey personal opinions or moral judgments. They channel voices from realms beyond the visible, calibrated through trance, divination, symbolism, or song. Their authority is experiential and relational, earned through ritual competence, ancestral blessing, and community recognition. In this way, prophecy in African spirituality is an embodied art. When a Babalawo recites an Odu verse under the night sky, when a Sangoma falls into rhythmic dance and is ridden by ancestral energy, when a Bokonon arranges a vave on the soil, when an Nga taps Nkisi with consecrated substances, or when an Akomfo sings into the royal court, it is more than ceremony. It is prophecy in material form, manifesting divine rhythm into human effect. It is when ancestors speak through flesh, when cosmos enters communal life, and when the spiritual spectrum informs governance, justice, healing, and morality. It is dynamism rooted in kinship with the dead, with the gods, and with the living earth. Prophets are not marginal voices, they are essential organs in the spiritual physiology of society. Their wisdom has navigated emperors and farmers, healers and seekers. Yet despite their cosmic authority, they were systematically silenced during colonization and the imposition of foreign religious doctrines. Tonight we begin to retrieve their legacy. We begin to ask, what happens when we remember that prophecy is not relic, but living possibility? What happens when we reclaim the wisdom of Babalawo, Sangoma, Bokonon, Nganga, and Akomfo? Can we home into a future shaped by ancestral alignment rather than doctrinal conformity? This is the first step in the reclamation, understanding prophecy not as power over time, but as attunement to it. As we continue, we'll witness these traditions at their height, see how colonial systems suppress them, and meet those who still carry the voice of spirit today. Their words were once essential. It's time to listen again. In African spiritual traditions, spirit possession is understood not as a frightening or chaotic disturbance, but as a sacred act of divine communication. Across rituals and ceremonies, individuals become living vessels through which ancestors and deities speak directly to their communities, offering guidance, healing, and moral correction. In Yoruba traditions, the god Ogun, huntsman, warrior, and metalworker, mounts the medium with clarity and authority. The possessed Sangoma in South Africa trembles and clutches her dancing staff as ancestral spirits enter her body and speak truths that transcend everyday language. In Benin or Togo, a Vodun medium channels spirits through rhythmic chanting, the rattling of sacred objects, and the body's involuntary gestures. These moments of possession are not displays of personal ego but divine embodiment. where the medium becomes an instrument of spiritual will. Similar to how Moses encountered a burning bush that spoke not in his words but in the voice of the divine, these mediums host voices that surpass their own identity. The sound is not the medium's opinion, it is spirit's message. In that trance state, the veil between worlds thins. The sacred fires within the communal circle ignite, the ancestors ascend. The medium may not remember every utterance, but the community listens, acts, and shifts in response. This is spiritual authority in action, validated by outcomes. Rain after drought, reconciliation after conflict, healing after sickness. It is not superstition, but trust built through lived efficacy and communal testimony. What distinguishes this from Western frameworks is not the presence of the spirit, but the communal structure supporting it. Drum beats set precise rhythms to invite spirit, ritual songs invoke ancestral names, consecrated spaces frame the encounter with cosmological significance. Possession is carefully prepared for and honored afterward, not feared or suppressed. The medium is protected, fed, and regarded as a sacred vessel, not a source of anxiety. They wear masks or adorn themselves with symbols of the spirit they host, clarifying the difference between personal agency and divine visitation. The messages spoken through these mediums can vary, from moral admonitions to strategic guidance for community leaders. At times, a spirit may chastise immoral behavior. At others, it may bless a collective venture or caution against political folly. Because the voice is not of the flesh but from beyond it, its authority is taken seriously. It transcends political power, legal systems, or scholarly persuasion, speaking directly to the heart of ancestral covenant. Yet these traditions were often misinterpreted by colonial authorities and missionaries, who labeled trance as madness and possession as demonic. But in understanding possession on its own terms, as divine embodiment within communal ritual, it becomes clear that prophets in Africa did not speak because they wanted to. They spoke because the Spirit spoke through them, rooted in relationship and ritual that carved pathways between earth and sky, living in ancestral realms. To witness spirit possession is to see prophecy and prayer converge in living flesh. It is to experience the moment when heaven touches earth and the ancestors reclaim their place as the guardians of human flourishing. When we understand this sacred art, we begin to see prophecy not as palace spectacle or private phenomenon, but as communal architecture, a spiritual system upheld by rhythm, recognition, and reciprocal faith. In the annals of African history, oracles were not peripheral mystics, but the beating heart of kingdoms, their voices wielding influence that shaped nations. Among the Yoruba-speaking peoples, the Ifa priests, Babalawos, served as trusted advisors to the Obas of Benin. With sacred palm nuts and kola seeds in hand, they interpreted the verses of the Odu Ifa, revealing ancestral counsel on everything from diplomacy to warfare. When decisions of war or alliance were weighed, rulers would convene with these spiritual technicians, trusting not in secular counsel, but in divine insight channeled through memory and ritual. These oracles guided generals on battlefield strategy, directed negotiations with neighboring states, and directed the moral compass of the kingdom. Their authority was built on ancestral legitimacy, achieved not by royal decree, but by sustained spiritual efficacy and communal recognition. Farther south, the Ashanti Empire rose in the late 17th century under the auspices of its most legendary oracle, Akomfo Anokai. Anokai was no mere priest, he was the architect of Ashanti unity and spiritual sovereignty. It was he who called down the golden stool from the heavens, a celestial throne that landed in his infancy and became the soul of the Ashanti nation. With the stool, he established an unbroken bond between divine spirit and earthly rulership, ensuring that every Asantehene, Ashanti king, was consecrated by prophecy and ancestral authority. It was Anokai's oracular vision and mystical mandate that rallied chiefs around a shared identity, turning fragmented states into an empire anchored in spiritual covenant. In the grasses of southern Africa, Zulu Sangomas played an equally defining role in the formation of the Zulu kingdom. Legend tells of Mkabayi and other Sangomas who used trance divination to foretell the rise of Shaka and to warn against internal threats. When Shaka assembled a council of Sangomas before battle, their visions determined the day's approach, the direction of marching, even the shape of the shield formations. On multiple occasions, spiritual revelation tempered his feared aggression, granting him a reputation not merely for military prowess, but for spiritual attunement. Without the oracles, Zulu royalty may have remained regional chieftains rather than forging a powerful central state. These examples underscore a vital truth. These prophetic figures were not fringe visionaries or mystical oddities. They were spiritual technicians whose work resonated through the corridors of power. Their oracles were central to decision-making, legitimate through divine sanction, and relied upon by rulers who saw them not as advisors, but as vital conduits between worlds. Their words shaped treaties and suppressions, directed the founding of states, and stabilized diplomacy in the pre-modern era. When the Oyo Empire allied with the Benin Kingdom, they did so with Ifa approval. When Ashanti diplomats chose friends or foes, they followed Anoke's vision. When Zulu war councils marched toward victory, they did so attuned to ancestral breath. These prophets of power were integral to the social fabric and moral compass of their nations. In the absence of written constitutions, their spiritual protocols served as binding law. Royal legitimacy was not inherited by bloodline alone, it was reaffirmed in oracular confirmation. The golden stool itself, shrouded, sacred, unattainable, embodied this integration of prophet and polity. To remove a stool was to challenge divine will. To ignore a Sangoma's vision was to risk calamity. Thus kings came to power not merely by battle, but by the consent of spirit and tradition. Colonial reports from missionaries and later administrators are filled with frustration as these spiritual voices diverted authority away from centralized imperial control. Governors found that treaties brokered by easy cash could unravel when local oracles intervened, reversing diplomatic deals in the name of ancestors. This is why colonial regimes often outlawed or discredited spiritual systems, viewing them not as religion, but as political subversion. By controlling the oracles, they would control the kingdoms themselves. Yet in spite of suppression, the oracles persisted, woven into royal rituals, funerary rites, oath ceremonies, and ceremonial warfare. Because prophecy shaped success or downfall, these prophets were literally state architects. The rise and cohesion of the Ashanti Empire is incomplete without Anoke's vision of unification. Duty-bound to uphold the ancestral oath, kings upheld justice, war, and legality through spiritual sanction. The Golden Stool replaced central warlords as covenant anchor. Similarly, Benin's Obas, guided by Ifa priests, maintained diplomatic and economic stability that defined their golden age. Zulu political consolidation prior to colonial encroachment used Sangoma visions to secure grassroots loyalty. To remember these prophets is to rediscover the spiritual infrastructure of African states. Their words were not allegory. They were pathways of ancestor-driven authority that coursed through polity, culture, ritual, and land. Their oracles shaped the fate of nations by harnessing spiritual power in communal service, weaving prophecy into polity in a way the West seldom recognizes. Tonight, we carry forward their lineage. We are here not only to acknowledge their power, but to understand that prophecy was not the margin, it was the center of African political life. And when we lost these voices, we lost not mythology, but the moral spine of nations. Colonial and missionary forces waged a relentless campaign to silence Africa's prophets, replacing vibrant ancestral voices with imported doctrines. When European colonizers arrived, they immediately targeted spiritual authority rooted in trance, spirit possession, and oracular counsel. Prophets, once central to governance and social balance, were recast as witches, sorcerers, or devil-possessed. Their rituals were condemned from pulpits and courtrooms alike. Their sacred drums were banned, their altars dismantled and replaced with crosses or mosques. Missionaries described trance states as insanity, spirit voices as demonic delusions, and public oracles as threats to civil order. The very heart of spiritual legitimacy was attacked. Prophecy, once seen as divine alignment, became potential criminality. The colonial enterprise depended on this transformation. By eradicating indigenous spiritual structures, rulers undermined the lineage of ancestral authority. They claimed that spiritual truth existed only within Christian or Islamic frameworks, erasing the validity of African religious epistemologies. Thus, kings and chiefs were disempowered not only politically, but spiritually. When prophecy could no longer affirm leadership, colonial power stepped in to fill the void. The violence of this erasure was institutional. Shrines once hallowed by generations were burned or repurposed, turning sacred ground into farmland or military posts. Ancestral masks were confiscated as pagan artifacts, ancestral psalms banned as forbidden chants. Families risked fines or imprisonment for hosting spirit mediums or for maintaining trance ceremonies. In Christian schools, children were taught that African spiritual practices were witchcraft, unclean, or inferior to Western faiths. Generations grew up ashamed to claim spiritual lineage. The sound of ancestral drums became a symbol of rebellion or backwardness, and many spiritual lineages went underground, passed in whispers far from the watchful eyes of authorities. The quote that encapsulates this era is chillingly precise. If the Spirit doesn't speak through you the way the Church approves, you are a heretic. That declaration was more than dismissal. It was a condemnation of identity. It meant that prophecy itself could be validated only through acceptance by Christian or Muslim gatekeepers, not ancestral consensus. As a result, institutional faiths gained priority in spiritual authority. Anglican, Baptist, Catholic, and Islamic preachers became the public spiritual leaders, while prophets were forced into exile, either literal or spiritual. This suppression was not only spiritual but epistemological. The methods of divination, trance, and oracle, once repositories of ancestral knowledge and ecological wisdom, were erased as unscientific superstition. Colonial administrators dismissed them as anecdotal rather than epistemic systems. But in doing so, they dismantled rich archives of indigenous cosmology, agricultural insight, healing practices, and jurisprudence. This was epistemic violence, the removal of knowledge alongside spiritual authority. The effects of this erasure are still felt today. Many communities have lost spiritual maps that once guided their relationship with ancestors, land, and leaders. Ecological rituals tied to rains, harvests, and lunar cycles were replaced by mechanical calendars or imported systems. Political leadership no longer consulted oracles on moral direction, relying instead on secular legal systems imported from colonial regimes, many of which still fail to root justice in communal, spiritual accountability. Yet the prophets never fully disappeared. Their voices were forced subterranean, carried forward in secret ceremonies, coded lullabies, and disguised rites. Colonizers underestimated the tenacity of ancestral wisdom. In remote villages and urban undergrounds, devotion to tradition persisted, even as it was redefined by necessity. Initiates absorbed trance rhythms by heart, families whispered ancestral names at night, herbal medicine and ritual laws continued quietly in kitchens and forest groves. And with each banned ceremony, spiritual resistance grew more determined. Recognizing this history is crucial for reclaiming African prophecy. By acknowledging suppression as deliberate strategy, we can begin to disentangle inherited shame from spiritual self-awareness. We can lift the conviction that prophecy must conform to foreign frameworks to be valid. We can reconstruct shrines, revive trance training, retrieve ancestral names, and listen again. The old patterns may have been broken, but not beyond repair. Reclaiming prophecy means not replicating colonial authority structures, but restoring spiritual sovereignty rooted in ancestral legitimacy. If we are to remember the prophets Africa forgot, we must first remember how they were erased. Only then can we rebuild, smudging out shame, reclaiming ceremony, redesigning spiritual pedagogy, and breathing life into ancestral voices once silenced. The highway of prophecy was paved over, but the roots still run deep, waiting for restoration. Across Africa and its diaspora, the spiritual lineage of prophecy refused extinction, enduring through adaptation, secrecy, and ancestral tenacity. In Nigeria and beyond, Yoruba Babalawos continue the ancient practice of Ifa divination, passing sacred Odu verses from master to apprentice in ceremonies that have survived centuries of upheaval. Under the canopy of ancestral wisdom, each candidate endures rigorous training, memorizing verses, learning ritual precision, and cultivating spiritual presence. Today, they still stand trusted before community leaders and families, palm nuts in hand, aligned with Orunmila's cosmic council. Despite the presence of churches, mosques, and secular governance, the divine voice reverberates through their gestures and words. In Benin and Togo, Vodun priests and priestesses also maintain spirit possession rites, weaving tradition into the fabric of contemporary life. In private gatherings, drums beat in concealed courtyards, consecrated water shimmers at the feet of altars, and spirits are invited to ride flesh once more. These modern Vodun practitioners honor Vodun Loa, spirits who speak through their bodies, offering directions on healing, family matters, and communal harmony. They exist both within and beyond official religious boundaries, recognized by their communities but sidelined by dominant doctrine. Further south, spiritual awakening continues to call new generations to become Sangomas in South Africa. Young people, troubled by dreams, struck by ancestral visions, or drawn to unseen forces, undergo a process known as ukuthwasa, a spiritual calling marked by illness, prompting, and longing. Under the guidance of senior Sangomas, they learn to channel ancestral energy through trance, dance, and divination. These new medium priests continue a lineage stretching back centuries, often balancing dual identities, a student by day, a vessel of sacred counsel by night. They minister to contemporary families with digital tools while honoring the timeless drum rhythms of their ancestors. These living prophetic traditions operate largely off the grid, or alongside dominant religious institutions, with much of their power hidden from public view. Their gatherings are whispered about in hushed references to the old ways, their homes corridors of coded ritual. Many adherents move seamlessly between church attendance on Sunday and Vodun ceremonies on Monday night. Their spiritual reality operates on two tracks, one visible, one concealed, both alive with ancestral vitality. Yet the true authority of these prophets lies in their spiritual efficacy. When families come with ailments beyond medical diagnosis, it is the Sangoma who uncovers an ancestor's grievance. When immigration or land dispute weigh heavy, it is the Babalawo whose divination provides clarity. When seasonal storms threaten crops, it is the Vodun priestess whose trance invocation brings communal protection. Each prophecy resonates with ancestral memory, emerging not from doctrine, but from relationship between medium and spirit, between ritual and cosmos. Though marginalized in official record, these spiritual systems continue to shape everyday life. They are conduits of ancestral resolve, reminders that spirit never disappears simply because it is unacknowledged. The voices of gods and ancestors still echo in dreams, appear in trance states, and emerge in ceremony. Their endurance challenges assumptions about religious purity and spiritual progress, offering instead a vision of pluralistic memory and cosmological endurance. These prophets still survive on the margins, but they are not powerless. They are architects of healing, counselors of justice, and anchors of cultural identity. In their continuity lies proof that African prophecy is not a relic of the past. It is a living force. It adapts, evolves, and reasserts its authority through hands that tremble with possession, tongues that speak in ancestral tongues, and hearts attuned to cosmic rhythm. When we listen, we still can hear the divine voice, underscored not by scripture alone, but by song, trance, and ancestral insistence. Reclaiming the voices of Africa's prophets is not a call to forsake other faiths, but a plea to restore spiritual equilibrium. This restoration means deepening the tapestry of belief by weaving back the ancestral threads that colonialism unraveled. When we acknowledge the legitimacy of Babalawos, Sangomas, Nganga, Akomfo, and Bokonon, we recognize that African prophetic traditions are not isolated curiosities, but vital strands in the fabric of global sacred heritage. These traditions predate imported religions and shaped communal life, morals, and justice in profound ways. To remember these voices is to embrace a fuller vision of what it means to be human, responsive not only to scripture and doctrine, but to the ancestral chords that vibrate beneath our skin and bind us to land, lineage, and collective destiny. Learning from elders becomes an act of spiritual repair, a conscious effort to receive wisdom rooted in rites older than the colonial archive. Sitting with a senior Sangoma and listening to their trance story is not nostalgia. It is active honoring of cosmic memory. Visiting a Babalawo, asking about your Odu, and performing ritual cleansing is not superstition. It is spiritual literacy. These are sacred ways of knowing that have sustained entire nations, cultures, and ecosystems for millennia. To embrace them is not to turn our backs on centuries-old faiths, but to credit spiritual longings with a broader compass. Honoring ancestral gifts means acknowledging that revelation does not belong solely to text-based religions. Spiritual voice does not cease after baptism or ordination. It thrives wherever trance is honored, drums vibrate communal pulse, and spirits are recognized as living relatives. Embracing the prophetic is an act of humility toward the mysteries that surpass modern definitions, transcending exclusive claims and allowing multiple channels of divine speech to coexist. In doing so, we cultivate a spirituality that is not zero-sum, but abundant, one that acknowledges the prophets Africa forgot while welcoming the guides that shape moral imagination worldwide. This reclamation is cultural renewal as much as spiritual healing. When indigenous spiritual frameworks were dismissed, communities lost more than ritual. They lost ecological understanding and moral accountability woven into reciprocal relationships with land and ancestry. When prophecy disappears, so does the architecture that balances exploitation with remembrance. The return of these voices offers a rearrangement of values, where communal care carries the weight of ancestral endorsement, where justice is not only legal but spiritual, where power is tempered by ritual, contract, and covenant. For individuals, reclaiming the prophets can spark healing on a personal and communal level. As people learn the name of their Orisa, feel ancestral possession during ritual, or commune with elder mediums, they re-anchor themselves in spiritual source. Patterns of dislocation, secular alienation, and spiritual fragmentation can begin to heal when ancestors are spoken to again, when prophetic hospitality opens its arms to acknowledge every soul's residence in ancestral memory. Communities begin to remember reciprocity. Trees are no longer resources but relations. Water is not commodity but ancestral mother. Laws are not abstract but embodied in song and symbol. Reclaiming forgotten prophets also sends a message to the world. Spiritual diversity matters. Just as political systems benefit from decentralized power, religious landscapes flourish when multiple voices share the stage. African prophetic systems speak not only of dreams, but of duty, to ancestors, to earth, to future generations. They remind us that divine call carries accountability, not just inspiration. To include them is to expand moral imagination, to redistribute spiritual authority in ways that resist imperial monopolies on sacred truth. As Africosmos One calls this continent and its allies to remember, the goal is not to replace, but to integrate. Prophetic traditions are not rivals to Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or secular ethics. They are complementary pathways to spiritual literacy. When practiced with care, they promote planting alongside Torah, Sabbath, and Dharma. Rivers become holy again when acknowledged by tradition, no matter the creed. This blended spirituality weaves ancient cosmic compass with modern ethical commitments and universal love. In remembering Africa's prophets, we recommit to a vision of spiritual kinship that spans time and tradition. We reclaim thresholds where the ancestors still speak into flesh, telling us how to live justly and in harmony. We reawaken ancient drums in the soul's body. We witness that prophecy is not archaic, it is an ancestral birthright that shapes who we are and how we belong. As we welcome these voices back, we say yes to a healing beyond memory, to a future aligned with wisdom older than empires. The prophets never vanished. They were silenced, but their voices echo still, in the wind, in the bones, in the dreams of a continent ready to remember. These words hover like sacred breath over the land, inviting not only reflection, but action. This is not the end of a story. It is a doorway back into memory, an invocation of voices buried yet not broken, ancestral wisdom calling out for acknowledgement. To all who have walked with us through this journey, we now turn to you. We invite you to speak. Comment the name of a prophet, oracle, or sacred tradition that stirs your spirit or anchors your lineage. Whether it's the Ifa priest who shaped your grandfather's decisions, the Sangoma who healed your family, or a story whispered from your grandmother's lips, let their name be spoken again. Let them rise through your remembrance. Subscribe to Africosmos One if your heart is stirred by this sacred storytelling. If you seek more than history, if you seek roots, rhythm, and reverence. Each video is not simply content, it is ceremony. Each voice we share is another drumbeat in the resurrection of memory, a return to the center. And most of all, share this with someone who is ready to remember. Someone who has been searching for home in the silence. Someone who has heard the call of something ancient but unnamed. Let this offering reach them. Let it be a guidepost on their return. Thank you for spending your time with us. Your presence here honors the ancestors and strengthens the memory we fight to preserve. May your dreams be full of voices once forgotten. May the spirit of prophecy find you ready, willing, and open. And may your life become a temple where the divine voice can once again speak.